Welcome to the Investing Show, where we discuss the news that matters to investors. I'm Simon Lambert of This Is Money. Joining me in the studio, I have Richard Hunter of Interactive Investor.
Simon?
Richard, it's not been a bad start to the year for investors. We're now in early March, and things aren't looking too unhealthy for them. The market is up a reasonable amount this year. It's still yielding a decent amount despite its recent rise, and things appear to have slightly calmed down in the world. So how far are we up this year, and what's the dividend looking like on the FTSE?
Yeah, the FTSE 100 in the year to date's up about 6.4%, which is going well. That's set against the context of 2018. Of course, we were down 12.5%. And that's also despite some recent strength that we've seen in sterling, as the currency bulls of sterling have started to take a slightly more positive outlook in terms of Brexit. And in normal circumstances, of course, that should have a limiting effect on the FTSE 100. Strength of sterling, not so good for FTSE 100 overseas earners. Nonetheless, there does seem to have been some return of buying into the UK. It was getting to pretty cheap levels historically after being beaten up somewhat last year. And as you rightly say, despite all of that, the dividend yield has held up, and it's somewhere around 4.5% at the moment on average for FTSE 100 companies. It's something that's often overlooked in terms of the US market, for example. That yields on average about 2.2%. The US companies just tend not to be big dividend payers, and there's only a couple of countries globally which tend to exceed the sort of dividend yield which you can get in the UK, which makes it an attraction, not the only attraction, but an attraction of itself, particularly, of course, when you compare it against the historically low interest rate environment we find ourselves in.
And just before we move away from the FTSE companies and onto the latest in the US and China soap opera, a couple of the retail names, big names to people, we've had a few developments with them recently, haven't we? We've had M&S and Ocado, we've got Sainsbury's and Asda, and we've got poor old Debenhams taking another pasting, haven't we? So just a quick run through there. Debenhams, why have they been hit again?
Yeah, this is one of the worst things you can do in market terms, although Debenhams have fallen into the trap, which is basically to say things are going reasonably well this year in terms of our 2019 outlook, and then to come back a couple of weeks later and say, actually, they're not. This is effectively kicking a man when he's down, but Debenhams' share price took a bit of a beating on the back of that. In terms of Sainsbury's, of course, the Asda part aren't quoted anymore. They're now part of the massive American giant Walmart. But in terms of Sainsbury, they've also seen their share price hit because, certainly in terms of the slightly unusual wording that's come out of the Competition Authority, the current bet seems to be that there's a possibility this merger won't actually happen. And that had certainly been underpinning the Sainsbury's share price up until then.
And that is one of those classic examples of something being baked into the share price. Is everybody presumed this one was probably going to squeak through, and now they're thinking, oh, it looks like it's going to get killed off. Absolutely right.
And there were some really odd comments coming out of the Competition Authority as well, such as prices could go up when obviously the companies will be arguing because of the synergies, prices should be going down. And that also, for the deal to go through, potentially one of the Asda's or Sainsbury's brand would somehow need to be sold, which was an extraordinary comment, which is just not going to happen because effectively you'll be back to square one. And then in terms of the other one you mentioned, Ocado continues to go from strength to strength. Its share price reacted very well indeed to that tie-up with Marks and Sparks. M&S took a bit of a hit on the simple basis of funding this particular move. They mentioned a rights issue. They took a 40% knife to the dividend as well. So there was a question of, whilst I think it's generally felt it will be a good long-term deal, in terms of the shorter term, M&S has taken the pain and Ocado continues its march.
And I remember an interview last year where we had someone come on the show who described Ocado as potentially a value play, and we did ask the obvious question of how can a value fund manager hold Ocado when it is so highly rated? But their response was, well, the market is rating, people are looking at Ocado as a grocer, we're looking at as a technology company, and that message seems to be filtering through now, especially as they've just they're doing this M&S deal. They got another deal last year. If they can keep up the momentum on that, maybe one day they'll justify that very high rating.
Well, yes, I mean, I think it's Kruger, wasn't it, of the US, the big deal they signed last year. One of the reasons to put an absolute rocket under their share price. And if I think I'm right in saying that in 2018, Ocado was the top performing FTSE 100 stock, and it just keeps, as a technology, it seems to be cutting edge in its space, and it keeps signing up some big names, and that's the sort of thing in terms of potential future earnings that the market loves to see.
Although you've got to be careful on a share that's so highly rated, haven't you? Because the
Certainly
slightest disappointment can hit you hard. Another name of such ilk, Purple Bricks, recently got a bit of a walloping.
Indeed.
So moving on from there to the Donald Trump US trade soap opera. What's the latest?
Well, we've had some slightly more positive noises. There are now some hopes that potentially some kind of deal could be reached by the end of March. The previous deadline of 1st of March was extended. Just to complicate matters slightly, Trump has now done something similar in its relationship with India, another massive economy, possibly the third largest economy in the world behind the US and China. So there's something else for us to get our teeth into in due course. But there's been an interesting side development, and this is something that's very difficult to measure at the moment, is that quite apart from the fact that we know economically it's not going to do either economy or either stock market much good, there could just be some slow move to some kind of patriotic feeling within China. And the way that's kind of showing itself is that we've already had news from Apple that they're struggling in certain parts of China, and the questions being raised is whether that's because Chinese consumers are now going down the Huawei route, in other words, buying at home. And over the last few days, interestingly, we've had similar difficulties being reported by Ford. Now, obviously, you've got to pick that out of the wider car industry and the manufacturing industry and the problems that it's having. But they're two interesting side effects, potentially, of the US-China spat in terms of US companies having a harder time in China.
And there are a number of companies in the US, in the UK, in Europe who have pinned a sizable amount of their hopes on the Chinese consumer story, aren't they? Be they a company such as Ford, selling into that emerging middle class, also Jaguar Land Rover, maybe the sort of upper middle class, and then you've got companies that have based quite a lot of their plans on selling more to Chinese sort of emerging, what we would call super rich here, the people buying the Rolls Royces and the Bentleys and the Aston Martins, and some of those companies are presumably having to revise some of their forecasts at the moment.
Well, it's interesting you should say that. We've got UK banks heavily exposed to the Asian region, such as HSBC and Standard Chartered. You've got Prudential, which has got a particularly strong presence out in Asia, and that's been a central plank of its strategy for some time now. And I think the other one that's probably being relied upon by the companies themselves is within the pharmaceutical industry, because it was one of these things where a decade ago Western medicine wasn't really being used in the Asian region, but inevitably, if the cultures are going to start to just overlap slightly, it's seen as a big potential, growth area there. So there are all sorts of industries within Europe and indeed the US, as you say, pinning their hopes on the emergence or continuing emergence of the Asian middle class.
So if you're an investor watching or listening to this show and you've backed one of these global companies that's previously talked about the amount of business it reckons it can do in China, or part of your investment case for this is the potential for growth in China, you want to be having a good look through the next company statement and looking for that line on China and see what it says about it, in the same way that we've previously advocated that people want to be looking through the statements of companies and looking for the bit that talks about online and digital, and make sure it's not just paying lip service to it, but is actually saying, this is our strategy, this is what we're thinking.
You're absolutely right. And of course, although the interesting two things always to bear in mind about China is, number one, the validity of the figures that are released by the central parties in terms of, this is what's actually going on in terms of our economy, because you tend to have the state standing behind anything out there, but there's an emerging debt problem potentially. On the other hand, the most recent noise we've had from China is that they're going to slightly downgrade their